Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Board Gaming Doctor. My name is Phil, and I'll be your Board Game Doctor today. In this episode, I give you my first thoughts and impressions on Galactic Cruise. This is a game that is currently on Kickstarter, and designed by TK King, Dennis Northcott, and Colton Thompson, with art by Ian O'Toole. Publisher is Kingston Key Games. This game plays for 1 to 4 players in 90 to 150 minutes. Its complexity rating on BoardGameGeek is a 3.88 out of 5. Its overall ranking is a 6,928 at the time of recording, and its overall average rating is 8.6 out of 10. As a quick overview, this game utilizes worker placement to fulfill the namesake of the game, to gather resources, to assemble shuttles, gather guests for space cruises, and to fulfill company objectives for points by the end of the game. Along the way, you can use cards and technologies to make your actions more efficient. This game offers a solo mode, a variant to play with 2 players, and variants to make this game shorter, in addition to a couple of expansions. Without going into more rules, let me highlight some of the mechanisms that make this game shine, to hopefully explain further how this game works. First, the worker placement aspect of this game. So in this game, the worker placement has 4 features that make this unique. First, when you play a worker to a space that is occupied by another, that player gets their worker bumped back to their tableau for a bonus. Second, when you play a worker, you take 2 actions, and you can choose to take an action or 2 from the spot that you occupy, or if it's joined by a technology tile, you can skip and use action spots away from your worker if desired. Third, when you launch a shuttle, you take a worker and make them your pilot of that shuttle, losing that worker for a few rounds, but using them to get points from cruising. Finally, you have expert workers that you can hire during the game, which have special effects when played. The second mechanism used is the complex objective fulfillment aspect. This game is more than simple resource conversion. In order to score big points in this game, you need to assemble many different parts to send shuttles into space. You have to acquire the shuttles first of all, blueprints to house the guests, advertise to guests and book them to your cruise, and have enough resources to keep them happy throughout the cruise. In sum, this game requires multiple turns of planning and actions and building up of resources in order to pull off a big combo at the end, which is to launch your ship. Third, the variability of this game. This game features many things that can switch things up to make each game feel different, including variable placement of worker placement spots, company objectives, shuttle combinations, cruise destinations, and the aforementioned agenda cards and technologies that are acquired during the game. There are expansions, as I mentioned before, that are offered during the Kickstarter of this game, which add complexity to the blueprint mechanisms, the technology track to the technologies that you start with. A sort of jump start with starting resources that you can play with as a module, and many more texts and agenda cards to add additional variability. Now, comparing this game to others, a lot of people have compared this game to Lacerda Designs, and I believe that this game was inspired heavily by Lacerda games, and in particular Kanban, but I think in action this game feels most like, to me, Weather Machine. And what I mean is both games portray complicated resource management and worker placement approach, with the main focus being assembling many different parts from across these worker placement aspects to ultimately trigger an action that is really big and worth lots of points. For example, activating the weather machine and having as many of your parts in that particular weather pattern when activated is the big turn in Weather Machine versus launching ships and maintaining them through Galactic Cruise. There's also a special shout out that I wanted to make to On Mars as well, with the ability of, in both games, in that as well as in Galactic Cruise, to benefit from the technologies researched by other players, adding to some interaction that is had during the game. The second game that I thought of was Clinic. This is another heavy game that requires a lot of planning ahead to fulfill your objectives, as well as thematic integration. Or in other words, a lot of the theme is the inspiration to what you want to try to accomplish in the game mechanically. Because of that, because life is oftentimes more complex than board games are, there are a lot of moving parts to keep track of in both games, as they do reflect very well the reality of what you're trying to simulate in both games. The third game is Arc Nova. Now, this comparison mostly takes place with the way that actions are taken in both games, or in other words, the flow of how actions tend to grow and your decision space grows in the game. In the early parts of both games, the actions may feel like they are limited or tight. As in Ark Nova, with your basic action cards, they are not upgraded, and so you're very limited in what you can do. It kind of feels the same in Galactic Cruise, where at the beginning of the game, you don't have a lot of those technology pieces on the board to connect the worker placement spots, and so you're kind of limited to where you place your worker taking actions there, or perhaps if there are some other players who develop technologies or neutral ones, you can hop over, and for a price, you can take those actions. But as both games open up and progress, you, in Ark Nova, upgrade your cards, your action cards, and you can use them in better ways, and the same thing applies in Galactic Cruise, where as more people develop technologies, the choices that you have are a lot bigger, and hopefully you have a better economy as well, so you can pretty much afford to do anything that you want, thus leading to an ever-increasing cascade of abilities and kind of a piling up of actions and resources to kind of really fuel a speedy end to the game, which both games end in a similar fashion, where it's triggered by an objective being fulfilled rather than having a set limited amount of turns. So both games in flow, for me in some, feel the same. Finally, my Rosenberg pick for Galactic Cruise is going to be A Feast for Odin. Both games to me feel very grandiose in what you're trying to accomplish. In Galactic Cruise, after learning the game, it feels a little bit more focused on what you're trying to do, and I'll go into that with my conclusions. But after playing A Feast for Odin many times, where at first it seems like it's a very big sandbox of options that you have to take, especially with the worker placement board, the more you learn about it, and this applies to the base game in particular, certain strategies start to surface as being more effective than others, and thus it becomes a race to try to achieve the same things while blocking others out of those options during the game. And so in Galactic Cruise, you're racing other people to grab folks to bring onto your cruise, to assemble your ship just right, and to launch them before anyone else does, so you can fulfill those company objectives faster as well. And so the grandiosity, the worker placement, as well as the race to achieve similar goals, I think is reflected in both games. For the peer review, after consulting with others on Board Game Geek, seeing what they rated and had to say about the game, some praises and concerns for Galactic Cruise. First, with the praises, this game is a hit with folks who really enjoy middle to heavyweight games with Euro-style mechanisms and complex resource management and engine building. Many people praise the development team for taking so much time and effort to polish this game to where it is today. It seems like it's a passion project by a small group of people, and that feels great. Once again, the thematic integration is high in this game, and that is applicable with how shuttle assembling and launching a cruise ship works in the game. Mechanically, it comes through. To some people, there are some great interactions in the game, especially with the interplayer benefits with the technologies placed on the worker placement board, sharing those abilities with each other, essentially, as well as the technologies that you can research to gain efficiencies during the game. Those can be shared as well. And so there is an element of interaction that is appealing to some. However, some people had some concerns that this game, when looking at the big picture, is not as complicated as it seems at first glance. The goal is pretty straightforward. Gather resources to build ships and launch them to send people on cruises. And so the repetitiveness of building ships and launching them, rinsing and repeating, can feel rote to some. Plus, the volume of resources and actions that you need to take to assemble and launch ships, plus the sheer amount of icons in the game, can really make the game feel bloated and confusing, often leading to turns where you're slowly incrementing up and building up to that launch, and to some it might seem a little bit like it's dragging. In other words, the strategy to some doesn't feel as deep as it first appears, and your objectives feel very pigeonholed, and there aren't many ways to take alternate routes to winning the game. So what do I think? I think this game is very well made, and definitely comes across as a passion project similar to games like Obsession. The rules overhead and the amount of complexity makes the game learn pretty steep. And with the iconography and rule set, I think if you're used to the sheer amount of icons that are present in a lot of Tool games / Lacerda games, then it's fine, but for those who aren't as used to it, it can be a pretty steep learn. However, after a few rounds and taking a few actions just to test out what they do, it becomes pretty easy to understand, and soon the overall strategy and picture of the game start to come forward, which I really enjoy, and I think the theme integrated with the mechanisms really helps there too. The solo mode is pretty easy to utilize as well, no complaints here from me. My favorite Lacerda game is Lisboa, and I feel that in that game there is a major objective of rebuilding Lisboa. There are enough side objectives to make each game feel different to how you come to your final score. You can focus on one or two different areas and aspects of the board to do so. This is what I adore about Rosenberg games too, where I feel there is a perfect balance between racing for the same major objectives with enough side quests or objectives to potentially distract, or to elevate your play in conjunction with your core strategy and make it more effective. I agree with folks that talk about the strategy of Galactic Cruise being somewhat pigeonholed and kind of tunnel vision to just launching your ships, with your actions becoming repetitive and in trying to accomplish that. It's a rinse and repeat type of play, with the order of operations perhaps being different from one game to another, depending on where the worker placement tiles are, the agenda cards that come out, the technologies, etc. Despite the variability of the different parts of the game as a whole, I can see if you are just trying to accomplish, the same thing over and over again, it can be repetitive to some, and I understand that. I really appreciate, though, the thematic integration in this game, and that this is something that I often look for in Euro-style games to really help me engage with the mechanisms. But in the end, when thinking about how excited I would be to play this game again, I was really happy to have played it and demoed it on Tabletop Simulator. This is a really good game. I think I'm not chomping at the bits to own it or teach it. I could probably play this game around 5 more times and feel pretty good about understanding it, albeit that is without playing the expansions and the added complexities and variances that those offer. And so I would for sure give this game a few more tries to see if anything different pops up, if there is more of a meta above the table that shakes things up while people are trying to, launch ships at the same time. When thinking about games that I enjoy, like Agricola, people often say that the goal of Agricola is to farm. You are racing to get families at the same time. You're trying to renovate all at the same time and accomplish pretty much the same things over and over again. The variability in that game comes through the cards, and when all is said and done, the way that your tableau is built can vary from game to game, where sometimes you win or do really well with a very small house versus a large house, or a small pasture collection versus a very large one. Maybe you've really gone into animals versus crops, etc. And so in that aspect, I think every game feels a little bit different. I don't know if that same variability is seen in Galactic Cruise, but I can see that the familiarity of having the same goal every time you play, which is basically to gather resources as fast and as efficiently as possible, to build and launch ships effectively. Maybe some ships are going to be really small. You have a lot of small ships. Maybe you have, two large ships or something like that. That probably will make this game feel replayable. And because it's very familiar with what you're trying to do every time, then the strategy becomes, how can I solve this puzzle based off of the agenda cards and the technologies, where the worker placement spots are, and who I'm playing with ultimately. And I think that is a really good sign of a game if you can really get the rules complexity out of the way and really hone in on what the board is trying to tell you and what people are doing so you can respond to them. And so I think this has all the makings of a really good game. I think it's, at first glance, a little bit too complex for me to really dive into, but as this game becomes more widely available and I have more chances to play it, I will happily play it again to see if it has longevity for me. So those are my first impressions on Galactic Cruise. Thank you for consulting with me today, and hope that you schedule an appointment with your board game doctor real soon. Take care.